They wheeled him into the courtroom slowly, the rubber of his chair's wheels squeaking faintly against the marble floor. Sergeant David Hale had faced fire in Fallujah, pulled comrades from burning wreckage, and crawled half-dead through enemy lines with shrapnel in his spine. But somehow this courtroom, this silence, this sense of invisibility, was harder to face than any battlefield. His body may have been broken, but his spirit remained iron-willed. Yet as he positioned his wheelchair near the aisle, straining to hear the proceedings from the back, he realized no one had planned for him to be there. There was no ramp to the front. No accessible space near the witness stand. No way to see the judge clearly or even be heard without shouting across rows of heads. He had not come seeking sympathy. He had come to testify, to speak on behalf of other disabled veterans navigating a legal system that often overlooked them. But as he sat there, dwarfed by architecture not built for men like him, he couldn't help but feel small. Forgotten. His attorney, a young and eager woman named Rachel Tran, glanced over nervously. "They're ready for you, Sergeant Hale." He looked toward the front of the courtroom. It might as well have been a mountaintop. From the elevated bench, Judge Malcolm Reed adjusted his glasses. "Sergeant Hale, please approach the witness stand." David wheeled forward a few feet before stopping. The narrow aisle ended abruptly, boxed in by rigid wooden pews. He looked around. There was no way through. I can't get up there, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but low. Judge Reed blinked. "Excuse me? There's no ramp. I can't access the witness stand from here." A long pause filled the room. Papers shuffled. Someone coughed. Finally the judge said, "Very well. You may speak from where you are seated." And so he did, from a shadowed corner of the courtroom, half hidden behind an oak pillar. His testimony was powerful, clear, compelling. But the moment had already shifted. The courtroom wasn't built for him, not just physically but symbolically. The very halls of justice were out of reach. And perhaps most painful of all, no one stood. No one adjusted. No one acted as though this was unacceptable. Outside, the sun shone without apology. Rachel wheeled him back down the courthouse ramp, a side entrance he had to use because the front stairs were too steep. She didn't speak until they were halfway to the parking lot. "I'm sorry, David." He gave her a tired smile. "Don't be. That's just the way it is." But it wasn't okay. Not to him. And not to the other veterans he represented. 2 days later, a small clip from the hearing was posted online. Just a few seconds of footage showing Sergeant Hale attempting to reach the stand, and then delivering his statement from the shadows. It was shared by a local nonprofit, and then picked up by Glimpse, a channel known for shedding light on overlooked injustices. What began as a ripple became a wave. Comments flooded in. "This man fought for our country. And this is how he's treated. Unacceptable. Build ramps in every courtroom now. What year is this? This is disgraceful." One particularly emotional comment came from a retired Marine who had lost both legs in Afghanistan. "When I saw that video, I cried. Not because I was angry, but because I know that feeling. Of being left behind even after you've made it home." Despite the growing support, David stayed quiet. He had never wanted to become a symbol. He just wanted change. Then one morning there was a knock at his apartment door. It was Rachel holding a letter. "It's from the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. They want you to testify again," she said breathlessly. "This time, on accessibility reform. The whole country's watching." He read the letter slowly, his fingers tracing the words. He wasn't sure if he was ready. But he knew he had to go. The day of the hearing he wore his uniform. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to remind them who he was. Who all of them were, the veterans sitting in the shadows waiting to be seen. The Capitol was a world of towering stone and gleaming floors, but David had never felt so grounded. He rolled into the Senate hearing room flanked by Rachel and 2 members of a Veterans Honor Guard. Cameras clicked. The room quieted. Senator Alan Morris, the chair of the committee, welcomed him. "Sergeant Hale. Thank you for being here." David nodded. He adjusted the microphone and spoke. "I didn't come here to be the face of anything. I came because I couldn't reach a witness stand. That was all. But what I've realized is, if I can't, there are thousands who can't. Veterans, seniors, people with injuries, disabilities, people with dignity. And when the places where we seek justice aren't built for us, then the justice we seek is incomplete. There was silence. Not the indifferent kind, but the heavy kind. The kind that means something is sinking in. Accessibility isn't a luxury, he continued. It's not an afterthought. It's a promise. And a nation that asks for your service should never be the one to overlook your existence. As he paused to sip water, a rustling was heard at the back of the room. One man stood, an elderly veteran in a faded Korean War cap. Then another. And another. Until nearly the entire back row was standing. David's throat tightened. He didn't cry. He wouldn't. But he bowed his head slightly. In acknowledgement. In gratitude. In quiet strength. For the first time since that day in court, he didn't feel like he was speaking from the shadows. He was heard. And the country was listening. The morning after Sergeant David Hale testified before the Senate, his phone buzzed non-stop. Reporters. Veterans. Lawmakers. Strangers. Some messages were long and tearful. Others just 2 words, thank you. But one message stood out, a formal email from the office of Judge Malcolm Reed. The same judge from that first courtroom hearing. The subject line read, regarding recent testimony. David stared at it for a long time before opening it. Sergeant Hale. I would like to offer you a formal apology. Not for a ruling or a legal decision, but for a failure of awareness. That day in my courtroom I should have stood. I should have seen you, heard you, and acknowledged the deeper issue your presence revealed. I did none of those things. But I hope to change that now. Would you consider meeting with me? I want to listen, truly listen, and I want to help fix this starting with my courtroom. David didn't respond right away. He wasn't angry. But he also wasn't sure what he felt. The courtroom that day had been cold, not just in architecture but in spirit. Could a conversation change that? 2 days later he agreed to meet. When David arrived at the courthouse, this time through a newly widened entrance with automatic doors, he was greeted not by a clerk but by Judge Reed himself. I asked them to remove the front pew, the judge said softly, to make room for you. David nodded, taking in the new layout. It was a start. They sat across from each other in chambers. No robes. No titles. Just 2 men on equal ground. I've presided over hundreds of cases, Judge Reed began. But I've never once thought about how someone in a wheelchair would experience this courtroom. That's the thing, David replied. You don't think about it until you're in the chair. They spoke for nearly an hour, about ramps, sightlines, microphones, but also about dignity. About what it means to be seen fully, not as an inconvenience, not as a hero, but as a citizen. And then the judge surprised him. I want to draft a proposal, he said, for the entire state judiciary. Accessibility standards in every courthouse. Not just minimal compliance. True, thoughtful inclusion. David blinked. You're serious? Completely. But I want you to help write it. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind. Judge Reed and Sergeant Hale, an unlikely duo, began collaborating on a set of recommendations. From court layout designs to training modules for staff, they worked side by side. Rachel Tran helped bridge the legal jargon. Veteran groups weighed in. Architects and ADA consultants offered guidance. Word spread. Glimpse published a follow-up video titled, The Man Who Moved the Bench. It detailed the unlikely partnership between a judge and a veteran, and how one moment of exclusion led to a statewide initiative for change. The video went viral, again. But while public praise poured in, David kept his focus on the mission. He didn't want headlines. He wanted results. One day, while reviewing proposed courtroom diagrams, David paused over a particular note in the margin. Judges bench height adjustable, optional removal for full visibility. He chuckled. Now that's a first. Judge Reed smiled. It's not about lowering justice. It's about raising access. When the final draft of the proposal was presented to the State Judiciary Board, David was asked to speak. He rolled up to the podium, not tucked in the back but right in front this time. I don't want to be the last veteran who struggles to speak in a courtroom, he began. I want to be the first in a long line of changes that says, you still belong here. That your voice matters. That we see you. He looked toward the judges seated in the gallery. Some nodded solemnly. Others scribbled notes. But all were listening. That night, David sat quietly in his apartment, watching the city lights flicker outside his window. He thought about the other veterans still navigating stairs they couldn't climb and doors they couldn't open. But something was different now. A door had been opened. And it wouldn't be the last. Weeks turned into months, and the small changes David Hale and Judge Reed had ignited began rippling across the state. Courtrooms added ramps. Benches were redesigned. Microphones were lowered. But something even more meaningful began to unfold. Awareness. A public service announcement campaign launched with the slogan, "Justice for all should mean all." Billboards displayed silhouettes of veterans in wheelchairs beside courthouse steps, with the tagline, "Make room for those who gave everything." The Glimpse channel covered these updates in a follow-up piece, which amassed millions of views and comments, many from disabled veterans finally feeling seen. Then one afternoon, as David reviewed accessibility blueprints for a courthouse in Nashville, an unfamiliar number called his phone. "Sergeant Hale?" the voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Senator Jonathan Morrison. I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee. We saw your testimony. We saw your work since. And we'd like to invite you to speak before the full Senate as part of our upcoming hearing on the Veterans Accessibility and Dignity Act." David froze. It was one thing to speak in a state courtroom. But this was the United States Senate. "I'm not a politician," David replied, his voice quiet. "That's exactly why we want you," Senator Morrison said. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. As David prepared, the weight of the moment began pressing on him. He reread his old journal entries from Walter Reed, where he'd scrawled fears of being forgotten, of being reduced to a case number and a folded flag. Now he was being called to testify for those who hadn't been able to find ramps, elevators, or even a willing ear. The day arrived with a cloudy sky over Washington, D.C. David wheeled himself into the Senate chamber, flanked by Rachel Tran and a few fellow veterans from his support group. The room was tall and intimidating, the kind of place built to make men feel small. But David had already lived through IED blasts in Kandahar. He wasn't afraid. When they called his name, the chamber hushed. He wheeled forward, paused at the table, adjusted the mic with care, and began. "Senators, thank you for allowing me this time. I come before you not just as a veteran, but as a man who once believed his voice didn't matter anymore." He let that hang in the air. There are hundreds of thousands of veterans like me. Men and women who served with honor, came home wounded, and then found their own country's institutions weren't built to welcome them back. He paused, eyes flickering toward the senators leaning in. But the fight doesn't end in combat zones. For many of us, the fight continues in courtrooms, in hospitals, at DMV offices, anywhere we have to prove we belong. He told the story of Courtroom 7, of Judge Reed, of the small step that became a movement. "But this isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about a principle. That dignity should not depend on your mobility. That accessibility is not charity, it's justice. It's patriotism in action." As he reached the end of his remarks, he looked down briefly, gathering his thoughts, then delivered a final line that would echo across news outlets and social media that night. "When I couldn't stand, others stood for me. That's what America should be. A place where we stand for each other when we cannot stand alone." The room fell silent. Then, something happened that no one expected. Senator Morrison leaned forward, opening his mouth to speak, but didn't. Instead, he stood up. A few seats down, Senator Watkins rose to her feet as well. Then another. And another. Soon, every senator on the committee was standing. Not out of courtesy. Out of conviction. Then, beyond the committee table, people in the gallery began rising, veterans, staffers, journalists, citizens. In the back, Rachel Tran stood with tears running down her cheeks. For the second time in recent memory, a room full of people had stood for a man who could not stand himself. But this time it wasn't a protest. It was a promise. Cameras captured the moment. The photo was splashed across every major paper the next morning. A veteran in his wheelchair, facing a sea of standing senators and citizens. Social media lit up with hashtags like #StandWithDavid and #JusticeAccessible. The next month, the Senate unanimously passed the Veterans Accessibility and Dignity Act. Funds were allocated to make every federal building fully accessible, including courthouses, post offices, and social service centers. State legislatures began reviewing their own facilities. But the change didn't stop with architecture. Hearts were changing too. Judge Reed became one of the first justices to host statewide training on accommodating disabilities in courtrooms. He told his colleagues not just about ramps and microphones, but about humility, about listening, about the day a soldier reminded him what justice really looked like. And David? He was appointed as special advisor to the newly created Office of Veterans Access under the Department of Veterans Affairs. His first initiative? A nationwide transportation program to help disabled veterans reach medical appointments, court hearings, and essential services, without asking for a miracle. David Hale had gone from being a man blocked by a bench to becoming the man who moved the whole system forward. David Grant's words echoed through the courtroom with a weight that silenced even the loudest voices in the room. "That day in the courtroom I couldn't stand," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "But what mattered most was that others stood for me. That's what America should be, a place where we stand for one another when we cannot stand alone." As David finished, the atmosphere shifted. Senator Callahan leaned forward, ready to respond. But before he could speak, something extraordinary happened. One by one, every member of the committee rose to their feet. Senator Matthews stood. Senator Delgado followed. Soon, the entire Senate Veterans Affairs Committee was on its feet, standing for David, a disabled veteran who couldn't stand for himself. The ripple spread beyond the committee room. Veterans, staffers, reporters, and spectators rose, filling the room with a wave of solidarity. In the back row, James Patterson wiped tears from his eyes. For the second time in 2 weeks, a room full of people was standing for a man who could not stand, but this time, it wasn't a protest, it was a promise. The image captured that moment perfectly. A man in a wheelchair facing a chamber of standing senators and citizens united by respect and humanity. Within weeks, the Veterans Accessibility and Inclusion Act passed unanimously in the Senate. The law allocated federal funding to retrofit courthouses, federal buildings, and public facilities to ensure full accessibility for veterans and all citizens with disabilities. State governments followed suit, revising their own infrastructure and procedures. Judge Marcus Reynolds, who had presided over David's case, became an unexpected champion for change. He volunteered to lead a judicial training program focused on disability accommodation in courtrooms nationwide. Sharing his own journey toward greater awareness, Judge Reynolds helped fellow judges confront and dismantle biases they hadn't realized they held. David was appointed special advisor to the newly established Office of Veterans Access within the Department of Veterans Affairs. His first initiative was creating Pathway, a transportation program designed specifically to help disabled veterans get to medical appointments, court dates, and essential services without struggle or delay. It was a simple program with profound impact. On the following Memorial Day, David was invited to speak at Arlington National Cemetery, a place where sacrifice is etched in every stone. Seated at the podium, David looked out over the rolling fields of white headstones, a sea of silent witnesses to sacrifice. "Today we honor those who gave everything," he began, voice resonating through the quiet morning. "But remembrance without action is hollow. True honor lies in how we treat those who came home, changed, scarred, yet still standing in their own way." He gestured toward the veterans seated nearby, some in wheelchairs, some using canes, others standing tall despite their wounds. "Some wounds you see. Others are invisible. But all are sacred. When we make society accessible to its most vulnerable members, we don't weaken, we strengthen the whole. When we stand for those who cannot stand, we all rise together." The crowd sat in reverent silence. No applause. No fanfare. Just the weight of truth settling like a bomb over their hearts. After the ceremony, David wheeled himself to Section 42, where many fallen from Iraq and Afghanistan rested. He stopped in front of a headstone, Captain Michael Reese, his commanding officer, the man who had shielded David from the blast that cost him his legs. David placed a small stone on the headstone, a Jewish tradition symbolizing remembrance and honor. "We're making progress, sir," he whispered, voice thick. Slow but real. A voice behind him broke the silence. "Thought I might find you here." David turned to see Frank Martinez, a Korean War veteran who had been the first to stand for him in that courtroom months earlier. David smiled. "Paying respects." Frank nodded, eyes heavy with memory. "Got a lot of friends here myself." They stood side by side, sharing the quiet. After a moment, Frank said softly, "When I stood that day, I thought about my friend Torres. Lost both legs in Korea, came home to a country that looked away, didn't want to see him, didn't want to remember. Things are changing." David met his gaze. "Because of people like you, Frank?" "No," Frank said, shaking his head. "Because of people who remind us what it really means to stand for something." Together, they moved slowly through the rows of graves, joined by veterans of all ages and injuries. Some walked, some rolled, some leaned heavily on canes, a living testament to resilience and brotherhood. 1 year to the day after that courtroom moment, David returned to courtroom 9. The space was transformed. Wider aisles, a ramp leading to the witness stand, adjustable desks, and most notably, the judge's bench had been lowered. As David wheeled forward, Judge Reynolds watched him closely. Beside the bench stood an empty wheelchair. A reminder, the judge said quietly, that justice must always see beyond physical limits. David nodded. "It's a start." "A good one," Reynolds replied. That night, alone in his apartment, David opened his laptop. His inbox overflowed with messages. Veterans sharing stories of local courthouse improvements, law students asking how to advocate, citizens expressing gratitude. One message stood out. A young soldier recovering at Walter Reed wrote, "I don't know if I can do this. How did you find the strength to keep going?" David's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he typed, "The hardest part isn't living with what you've lost. It's remembering what you still have to give. You don't have to stand on your own to stand for something. And when you can't stand alone, remember, others will stand with you. That's not weakness. That's humanity at its strongest." He sent the message and looked up at the framed photo on his wall, the courtroom scene frozen in time, senators rising while he remained seated in his wheelchair. It wasn't about him. Never had been. It was about the truth he'd discovered in vulnerability. True strength isn't the ability to stand alone. It's the courage to stand for what matters. And the wisdom to let others stand with you when you cannot. In that truth, David found not just purpose, but peace. And in that peace, he helped us all rise.